right? Let's get started. Anthony, let's kick off the show formally now. We've been chit-chatting, but let's do it.
All right, guys. Anthony Angelillo, branch manager with Paramount Residential Mortgage Group over in Miami Shores, and CEO, founder of Tag Team Nation, marketing, e-commerce, and tech company, and also top originator of 2020 and hopefully 2021.
Let's do it.
It's been a good year so far. A couple things that have held us back, but we've got a lot of things going out, and we're going to be launching some nasty stuff very, very soon. So that is why part of the reason I'm working from home, to try to get things done and hammer out what we're envisioning for you buyers agents. But partner and co-host of Damage Control. And it's funny because Melinda and I were talking about this yesterday on how we literally launched a company through COVID because last year was challenging, man, for a lot of individuals in business. And here we are launching a company during tough times. So it's awesome. It's a blessing to have all of you subscribers watching our show, either now or after. We're noticing a lot of people watching and afterwards too. So it's cool, man. With that,
yeah, it's cool because hopefully you're out there getting some business, right? But that's the beauty of technology. If you're available, if you're driving, if you're able to catch in live, it's amazing because you guys can send us questions or feedback in the chat. But if not, the replay is always amazing, and you could always reach out to us after. So with that, I'm Melinda Grimaldi, real estate and title attorney of Grimaldi Law Firm and the Closers Title Insurance Company, and co-host of Damage Control, and ready for the weekend. It's been a very challenging week for me. So I'm happy to be at the office today and getting through and on the show and kind of going back into routine. So let's do it. So you cannot talk about real estate, about marital status, about really anything in that genre without understanding Homestead. So a lot of people use the term homestead, but I don't know if they really understand the ramifications of that. So I'm going to go through and explain it to you guys. I've said this before. I've explained it before, but literally it's the hardest part of the Florida bar is the homestead section. Yes. So it's the hardest part of the Florida bar because it's a very, it's not such a straight line concept, and not all states have it. So they always test on it to keep to protect Florida's bar, right? From everyone wanting to move to Florida. And so that's a little bit of a background of the homestead. We actually, in law school, I took a Florida constitutional law class. This is a constitutional law concept for the state. And so half the semester, we just studied homestead because there's so many layers.
I think agents only know the tax portion of it. I don't think they understand, what you're going into, creditor and family and all of that.
Right. So this is how I want to start the show, because I'm going to give you Homestead 101. It's going to be a crash course. And maybe we will kind of type out an outline for you guys to understand that.
My notepad.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of taxes, we can knock that one out right away, right? So, but before we go into the taxes and all the other things that Homestead gives you, Homestead is your primary residence. You cannot have more than one homestead. For tax purposes, you can file a document with the county to claim your homestead, but it may be challenged depending on where you live, how long you live there. So the idea is it's got to be your primary residence where you reside the majority of the time. You cannot have more than one. So all these different categories of homestead can later come back, and you can be challenged to say that's not really your homestead, and so there's ways to prove it. Like you want to have it on your driver's license, you want all your main bills to have that as a mailing address, things like that. So just bear that in mind. But let's go into the tax exempt. So there's 3 categories or things to consider once you have a homestead. If you own a property as your primary residence, you get the benefit of a tax exemption. So what does that mean? Your taxable value will be reduced on how much you're being taxed on that property. So let's say your property is worth $100,000. I believe it gets reduced by 50,000 right now. Just the homestead part. There are other exemptions that you could tack onto that, but it gets reduced 50,000. So you'll only be taxed on 50,000. Okay.
And per your certificate of eligibility, if you're a veteran, okay, depending on your disability, you could be 100% exempt from taxes. So that's why if you have a VA client, it's always wise to have them prep your COE in advance, so that way we can see that they're exempt from taxes.
Very good. That's a good tip too. So in addition to reducing what you're being taxed on, you also get capped. So if you don't have a tax exemption and the market skyrockets and they reassess your property values are going up, and it's an investment property, or you own it in an LLC or other entities, they can go up whatever it's assessed. But as a primary residence, it gets capped at 3% increase per year. So when you see that elderly couple that is selling their home and you're like, man, their taxes are so low, that is exactly why, because they've been capped from years ago, like multiple real estate, multiple booms ago, right? Not just one, but two probably, right? Decades ago. So that's why they're so low, is because there's that cap. So it's a very valuable tool, something you want to do as soon as possible. And a little bit, I'll just give one more minute on this, is like it gets assessed and the exemption applies as of the first of the year. So when we're doing a closing, if the seller has it as of the first of the year, the buyer will inherit it for that year. Then they need to apply so that they have it based on for the following year. Okay. So we always guide our clients on how to apply and give them tips as part of our process, but it's important for agents to know there's usually a form. Nowadays, you can do it electronically. You submit it to I just did mine a couple months ago because we closed last year. You do everything online. And then if you had homestead on a different property, is actually portability. So you could bring your savings and your caps from there and bring it over. So that's homestead tax exemption, which is a very popular concept. I think most people understand, at least that it lowers your taxes, right? Now we're going to go into the next layer of protection, or what homestead could give you. Homestead gives you creditor protection. Not all protection. It's not like totally open and protects you from everybody. There are exceptions, as there always is in law school. Like, in law school, there's the rule, there's the exception, and then there's the exceptions to the exceptions, right? So for this particular creditor exceptions, basically, if a creditor sues you, they cannot take your home. That is a general rule, right? So when people call me like, oh, I want to set up creditor protection for my home, I say, you already have it, because it's your homestead. Now, if that status change.
And assets too. Any asset, right?
Well, the asset of your house is protected because
Okay.
your house is your homestead. Other stuff you might need to do protection for, depending on what you're doing and what, business you're in and whatever. But with regards to your primary residence, it is protected from creditors. Default rule. What are the exceptions? There are 3 super creditors. Of course, you have to pay your mortgage. That makes sense, right? They got to build in that exception, because otherwise no one's going to lend you money if they can't foreclose on your property if you're not paying your mortgage. So they can foreclose. The second exemption is contractors working on that house. So what does that mean? That means that they can go in and work on your house. And if they file the proper paperwork and you don't pay them, then they can foreclose, file a lien and foreclose on that lien and force you to sell it. Most of the time what happens is they have the lien on the property and then you try to sell it and then you can't sell it and it gets paid at closing. That's usually what we see. But that is creditor, the contractors, not just contractors, but material men. So it's also the people who provided the windows, the doors, the stuff to build the house, as well as the people who built it and the subcontractors. But there's a very technical procedure for that. So to be able to actually foreclose, they need to follow those very particular steps to do that. and there's notice requirements, et cetera, built into that. So that is the second exception. The third exception are property taxes and income taxes, any kind of taxes, right? So if you don't pay your income taxes, the federal government can take your home, and the federal government or the county can eventually force you, to do those sales for property taxes. There's a whole system on how they do it, but they could actually sell your property if you don't pay your taxes. This is like after many months or years, and that's, there's a whole procedure to it, which we're not going to get into, but it's possible. So those are the three majors, and I'm gonna underneath the umbrella of the of this is also, if it's a condo, you also the association can foreclose on the unit if there are dues that are owed, right? Assessments, regular or special assessments. If they are owed and they're not paid, eventually you'll get a lawyer's letter. Eventually they'll file suit and they'll foreclose, and they will own the property and not you, even if it's your primary residence.
What about a judgment?
A judgment from anyone other than people I listed. So other than your lender, your properly filed contractor, or material man, the federal government, or the association. If it's not one of those, then you actually can have the most beautiful house and they can't take it from you. So I don't know if you guys remember, but way back when, after O.J. Simpson got off on the criminal charges, they knew that the civil charges were coming. So they basically he put all his money in a house in Florida. And it's very clear why that was done, right? Because this is my house, this is where I'm going to live. And now he's not the only one that did that, but it's a very large scale and common example that people use. We actually had that example in law school back then that we talked about. Why do you think people do that? Why do you think people come and pay cash for a multi-million-dollar home and tie up all those funds? Is because they want to protect those funds for their family. Because what happens is, once they pass, even though those creditors still exist, the creditors can go after other assets upon your passing, but not the home. The home passes still clear without any debts, which is a huge tool if used properly. So something to think about, okay? Creditor protection. Now, the last one is the one that gives us, the creditor protection also gives us issues in closings, because when you hear us talking about contractors on the sufficient funds affidavit, the contractor needs to sign something for closing. Is this tax judgment yours or not? That's because these are super creditors, and we need to make sure if it needs to get paid to clear title, we have to pay it. So that does come into play in closings, not as often as the next exemption, or not exemption, next exception. The next exemption is a family protection exemption. So the reason why to understand a law, you have to understand, one of the reasons how to interpret a law is to understand the intention behind it. What is the public policy behind the law, to be able to, so that you could understand the law? It's a great tip to understand. So back when this was implemented, people were able to go and gamble or drink their money away, and then basically sign the house from underneath their spouse and gamble their house away. Right? Or another common example used is you have your spouse and then you have your baby mama, right? And then in your will, you want to leave everything to your baby mama, or the new side chick, or whatever they call it nowadays, So there's those are things that actually used to happen, and probably still happen in some forms or fashions, right? But when it comes to the marital home, the family home, the primary residence, regardless of if your spouse is on title or not, that property is protected from alienation, which means you need the spousal consent for a lot of different things. So let's break it down further. To be able to will your property, your primary residence, I have my home, I'm married and I have minor children, right? So I cannot give it to anybody else but my spouse and my kids. That's it. The house is protected for them. So it's basically the state legislating to protect the family unit. Think of it that way. Okay. To protect that family unit. So I cannot give my property away in my will or my half or anything to anyone other than them, even if it's just me on title, right? So right now I have title with my husband and I, so that's a different analysis, different thing. But let's say it was just me. I bought it from before I was married. I still can't give it away. Because even if it's a non-marital asset for divorce, like, okay, so I want to talk about that in a second, because I know those questions are going to come up. What if it's a property from before I got married? It doesn't matter, because right now you live in there with your family. It's your primary residence, and you cannot sell it. You cannot transfer it. You cannot devise it, which means you cannot will it or put in your trust without spousal consent.
However, can't you quit claim someone on title and now you're good?
Well, once you can quit claim someone on, but that addition still needs spousal consent. You cannot do nothing. You cannot even refinance. We're going to get into that. You cannot even refinance your home as the only borrower, the only title owner without your spousal consent, because the idea is you're going to take cash out or you're going to do something with the equity of the home and then do something else. What if your spouse doesn't consent to it? We need to protect the family unit. Yeah. So it cannot be transferred. It cannot be sold. It cannot be devised, which is willed or like given away upon your death without spousal consent. Now, there are things such at death, there are things that prenups and agreements can handle sometimes. But during your lifetime, regardless of what your prenup says or your postnup says, it does not matter. We still need spousal consent. And this consent requirement is why we're having this show today. And we're going to go into how this impacts different types of deals. Okay. So does everyone...
That was awesome.
Thank you.
It was a great explanation.
So if you have any questions, we're monitoring the chat, but I'm going to go into, we're going to start with the easier analysis, which is the seller. Okay. We'll start with the seller. So if you have a seller and that seller is married, and they are selling their primary residence, the spouse must consent. Must. There's no prenup. There's no postnup. There's no waiver. It must be signed. If you're the seller, must. So what does that mean? That means that the seller's spouse does not need to sign the listing agreement. The seller's spouse does not need to sign the contract, but the seller's spouse must sign the deed. Must. So if you see at the beginning of a transaction, we are always asking marital status of the parties. This is why, because we need to know who needs to sign what by when, right? But as an agent, if this is your listing, you're at the listing appointment, and we always talk about the proper intake, right? You do not need to get that spouse to sign off, but maybe you should. Why? Well, if the spouse is there, you're probably cool because listen, selling a home is not a little quick thing that people do, right? It's a big decision about usually it's a big decision about who you're going to hire to help you. What's the price? You're going to want your spouse's input. Because you're going to be moving somewhere else, how much money we're going to have, what are we going to do, right? So this is usually a family decision. But if that spouse is in there at the listing appointment or included in the conversations, that's your first hint that there may be maybe not, right? Maybe one spouse is in charge of, and they just kind of take over and they do all that stuff. Or maybe says, you just handle this portion of it because I don't have time for it, right? Sometimes my husband and I work like that because we're so busy. So, okay, you handle this, I handle this. And then when it's time for like the final decision, like these are the two things, then we go to each other and say, this is what I figured out, right? But not all people are like that. Some people do everything together. Some people do things apart. Some people have separate finances. So you don't need to ask all those questions, but you need to understand if you're going to be sitting down with a client and having these conversations about selling their home, one of the questions you need to ask is, are you married? They're going to, okay. So now this is where Anthony, I think this is where you're going to
this is,
I don't know.
Go ahead, keep going. I don't want, you're going well.
So are you married? There's a couple different ways they could answer it. Yes, no, well, ... we're separated, or why you need to know this. Like those are pretty much the 5 different categories of responses. So yes, okay, great. Is your spouse here? The why I ask is they're going to be involved. Are they going to be okay with this? Because yeah, even though you're the only person on title per the deed, your spouse will still need to consent because this is your primary residence. Then
Seller.
Seller. So this is the conversation you're having, right? You're letting them know your spouse will need to sign the deed, set the expectations. Why? Because if they are estranged, yes, I'm married, but my spouse lives over here and they're doing their own thing, and I haven't spoken to them in 5 years. Well, are they going to be okay with coming to closing or signing, or what do we need to do in advance to make sure this is cool? Make sense? So that's if they say yes. If they say no, great, good. That's simple enough, right? But people lie, people whatever. But okay, that's why you respond. Great. I asked that, and even the way you set up the question, I ask because in Florida, when you're selling your primary residence, regardless where the person lives or what they do, if you're married, the spouse must consent. So they will need to sign some documents at closing. So I just want to ask now, are you married? So if they are going to lie, or they are going to they already know I could screw up my closing. Let me figure this out early. Okay. So that's the no. You set it up so that they know the ramifications. It's like, I'm not trying to hit on you. You don't have to say it like that, but like you have to set it, you have to say it, why it's an important question, right? Why is this an important question? Are you married? So an important question I have to ask for the closing process is, are you married? Because yada, 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 right? Okay. I'm separated. We're separated. We've been separated for many, many years. Okay. Well, that is a more layered response, because in Florida, there is no such thing as legal separation, right, Anthony? You even have, like, as part of your workflow, if someone answers that question, who's buying, and we'll talk about that later, there's no such thing as legal separation in Florida. That works on all fronts. So I don't care that you live in separate, that you're dating separate, that you've moved on and have kids. If you never got legally divorced, it does not matter. You need a divorce decree to say you're single. Otherwise, that spouse must consent, even if they have no interest in the property. Even if, so sometimes it's easy to get, and sometimes they haven't spoken in years. Sometimes they're estranged. Sometimes they're pissed, right? So you don't want to be having this conversation at the final hour when it's time to sign documents, right? You want to have, as a seller, listing agent, you want to have the conversation early, set it up so that, you're not working your ass off as an agent on something that's never going to close, or that requires a year because they can't find the guy. And then there's a certain way to do a divorce. When you can't find the guy, you have to do a publication of the guy. The lady could be a lady too. I'm just saying the guy.
You got to rank on the dudes, man.
I always do that. That's default. My default position, it's always the guy that's the bad guy. So, okay. So there's no such thing as legal separation. So it's either married or not. So be confident enough to say, okay, we like that there's no legal separation in Florida. Let's talk to a real estate attorney so we can organize ourselves to see what exactly is needed. You don't have to say it all, but give me a call. We'll do a 3-way. We'll have in two minutes, I'll explain it away and then guide them depending on what the relationship and ability is based on that. Okay. So and sometimes it's like, oh, they got to sign separately in different rooms. We've done all that, we're in the process of getting divorced. Doesn't matter. It's either you're married or you're divorced. No in between, right? So even if they're in the process, they will both need to sign. And if they're in the process of getting divorced, it's a little bit more complicated because what's going to happen with the proceeds, there's a lot more layers to it. And usually the divorce attorneys are more involved in the process when that happens. Why are you asking this question response? We already kind of went through that. If you set it up properly in the way you ask it, they'll give you the answer. It's super important to have that question in your intake for both sellers and buyers. Super important. Yes, Anthony, I think you were
So,
gonna.
all right. So real quick, the intake form that a buyer's consultation that you should have as a real estate agent, okay, and if you don't, you will have one very soon. The question that you want to ask as an agent is, are you married, unmarried, or separated? Right? And the loan officer asks that question. And do not in your head right now say the loan officer does that. No, a good agent will do that. An agent that doesn't want to waste his or her time will do that. The next question, will your spouse be present at closing? Done. That's an open-ended question that has to be answered. What do you mean? I don't know. We're separated.
And you could use those same exact questions on the seller side.
Right. So exactly. So will your spouse be present at close? And how I know this is because this is what I'm doing right now. But the bottom line is that's what we ask. And the question is a trick question. Why does my spouse have to be present? There's no legal separation in the state of Florida. They have to sign. And so that delivery is going to give you an answer right off the bat. So then you can go into, hey, you're going to have to speak to the lender at this point. You will need a divorce decree. Or my spouse is in a different country right now. That's an issue. All right.
That's a separate issue because
a whole different ballpark. Because how are they going to sign? Are they flying back? Are they going to go, to the embassy to sign? Like what's the scenario? So these are questions that we ask as loan officers, and a good loan officer should ask that question. It's not to get personal. It's to have clean data enter in. So clean data is enter and out. So that way you're not wasting time, man. But I wanted to leave it at that. Go ahead, continue.
So that's pretty much it on the seller side. It's important to have the intake because we really don't want to be at the final hour and not able to get that spouse to come in to sign. Because either they're estranged, they're pissed, they don't live here, and they don't want to cooperate. And speaking of not cooperating, I'm going to share a story of a file that we had.
I got plenty.
I know. So obviously our intake is on point. Obviously, I've been working over many years to make sure we ask all the extra questions, not assume that the agent did their job or that the lender does their job, because
second pair of eyes, third pair of eyes. It's reinforcing who you're working with.
Exactly. So we do a lot of extra questions and requests and updates because of that. And that's just, that's really it's out of my nature to do things a certain way and to have control, but it's also to control my own paycheck because I only get paid at closing just like you guys. And I don't want to put my paycheck in somebody else's hands that I could have caught something sooner and make sure, right? So in the earlier days, when we had a lot less files, if 9 out of 10 closing, if 1 out of the 10 closings didn't close, that's a big hit, right? Now it's different, right? As you grow, and if there's an extension, there's an extension. But in the earlier days, I'm how do I stop these files from getting extended or closing on time? And there's only so much I can do, but whatever I can do, I will. So that's a little backstory about how I set up my systems and why systems are so important in my business because of that, right? I need to control my paycheck. So the systems are what keeps the deals on track. That's the backstory. So now we have automated systems that request the information, but you can't control someone who doesn't respond to requests, right? So what happened in this deal just last month? The agent didn't ask or forgot to ask or something. The lender didn't ask. And we asked, but she didn't respond. She ignored the request. We asked a few times, and we only found out when it was time to schedule. And this spouse was in another country. So everybody, all the professionals knew, and there was an estranged spouse in the Caribbean who didn't trust anything and didn't want to sign, even though he had no responsibility on the mortgage. And we'll talk about that later, what that means. But they didn't sign. And what happened? The buyer had to cancel the contract and lost half of the deposit because the seller kind of felt bad. But
That's terrible.
That's what happened. And I said, so that's why we're doing this today as a reminder to everybody, even though we know it's a good refresher for ourselves. Like, when, because at the end of the day, we ask the information so that we could act on it. Right. But if the invitation's not given, then it doesn't trigger us to act on it. And then but if everybody would have asked, then we would have been in a different place by the end. Right. At the end of the day, for a buyer, for a borrower, I think the true buck lies with the lender to ask that question because they know what they need. Unfortunately, people like to place blame on other things sometimes, and it is what it is. But the lender should know I can't lend you money if you're on a purchase of your primary, and it's a primary because that's the type of loan you're putting them in. So are you married?
Those questions, and I see this all the time at previous companies that I used to work at. And when I was managing as a regional manager, I would see it. I was overseeing 5 branches. I would see loan officers skip the declarations page. What have they declared? The ethnicity. We don't need to ask this. You need to ask all of these things. We need to know if they're a U.S. citizen, because that's an issue right there. That was big alien cards and all that stuff that people were skipping over and then closing. They couldn't do specific programs. So where I'm going with this is asking those questions are so important as a loan officer, but they're just as important as a buyer's agent, and it's imperative.
Why?
Because the buyer's agent is the first point of contact.
Usually,
and
yes.
and I work with very good buyer's agents, and I just explained this to a really good buyer's agent the other day. I said, we just came out with our short form app, and he's like, well, these are too many questions. Too many questions. There's 7 questions, man. And at the end of the day, I go, what's too many questions is the 7 hours that you took tour guiding someone that didn't qualify. And he goes, yeah, you're right.
Especially nowadays.
7 freaking days, man. 7 days playing tour guide. We could have addressed this in 7 minutes. So that's important, especially today.
Especially today, because we ain't got time to show properties to buyers that never could have closed to begin with. Never mind the issues we're having with inventory and all these other things.
Yeah.
But it's super important. So let's talk about how it impacts the buyer in the process. So if it's a cash buyer, it doesn't matter, right? Because as a cash buyer, you're just receiving it and that's it. You're buying the property and it's yours. You'll have to deal with that on the sale. Now, where it becomes an issue is if you're getting the loan. Why? Because in the title hierarchy of how documents are recorded is you buy the property, even though you get the money first to be able to buy the property, the deed is recorded first and then the mortgage. You cannot mortgage a property you don't own. So basically the deed is recorded first and the mortgage. Okay. So once you own it, then you have to mortgage it. You can't mortgage it if you're married and your spouse is not consenting. So that is why, but I don't even own it yet. Why does my spouse need to consent? Because in the way, like there's actually, like, we don't just send documents to recording. There's a specific way we send documents for the chain of title. So if you're curious, we put all the documents to clear title first. If there's a power of attorney for any of those documents, those get recorded before the document to show the authority of that person signing. And then we have the purchase document, the deed, and then the mortgage. So that's the hierarchy. Okay.
Awesome.
That's why you're owner before you're a borrower. And that's why the spouse must consent. So that, and same thing with a refinance, but you guys are not part of the refinance process, but know that that's the same would apply. You think of it more in the refinance structure because I own the property and now I'm going to finance it. So I need my spouse to consent, but it's the same thing for purchasing. So the intake is super important because you don't want to be wasting time. And it's as simple as those questions that Anthony, so we'll if you're one of our subscribers, we'll put all these kind of little notes for you guys and the and the questions, those 2 questions that Anthony asked, is the best way to do it. And so that you have that as part of your intake form if you don't already have marital status questions. So speaking of the spouse consenting, there's a big misconception that to be on title, you must be on the loan. So I want to pause right now and talk about this. Just because one of the spouses is the borrower, they're the one that is financially more stable or has better credit, or they don't want to tie up both parties because they might want to invest in something else later. There's many reasons why only one person is on the loan. If there's only one person on the loan, does not mean that there can't be other people on title. So when you're making the offer, you need to put on the offer whoever will be on title, not who's going to be on the loan. Okay. So if husband and wife want to own the property together, both names need to be on the offer. So what happens a lot is clients think just because one of the parties is going to do the loan, they only put that party on the contract. And then we get to the final stages and we're scrambling to amend the contract, amend the title commitment, let the lender know, change the package around. And sometimes we're too far in the game that we can't make those changes at the closing table. So it's important to understand the distinction between those two. And then on top of that, understanding that the spouse, even if they're not on the mortgage, like they're not a borrower, they still will have to sign the mortgage to consent. They will both be listed as borrowers on the mortgage, more than likely, because it's this template form. So it won't say, the proper way should be so-and-so borrower, comma, joined by their spouse, so-and-so, comma, but that's not how these templated forms are written. The person responsible for the mortgage is whoever signs the note. The spouse, the consenting spouse, non-borrowing spouse, does not need to sign the note. They will only sign the mortgage, which is the consent. They are not they are not personally liable. This is a very important distinction to understand as a realtor, that the borrower signs the note and the mortgage. The consenting spouse just signs the mortgage. What were you going to say, Anthony?
All right. So, because we have 15 minutes and I want to get this out. Pay attention, everyone. There is a primary homeowner, okay? Primary homeowner wants to purchase a home, married, right? They can't purchase a home without their significant other, their spouse, right? However, they can purchase a second vacation home and an investment home without them consenting. Okay, so true story. Abused woman, God bless her, registered nurse, closed her 2 years ago, I want to say, I think it was 2 years ago, and really bad marriage. She let me know everything that was going on. And her husband was obviously verbally and physically abusing her. So the workaround on that scenario was that the mother and father rented, okay, and they never owned a property. So before she was going through the divorce, because he wasn't allowing her, wasn't signing, and just didn't want to have it, we basically took mom and dad, who was going to live with her, all right, and that was the case, and that was a true point example. There's nothing illegal about that. Put it under their name, and they consented, and they added her to title after they got a divorce. Right, so that was a workaround on trying to, get the loan to get her out of that bad marriage. So there's ways and loopholes around these scenarios that are compliant and legal. Significant other sister co-signing with mom and dad to increase income, all parties on title, and then putting it under possibly a will or a trust. Whatever the case may be, there are workarounds. Typically, a single parent going out of a divorce is not going to have 10% down on as a second vacation home or 20% down as an investment. So yeah, there's a loophole, but the down payment stops them. So
right. So that's what I was going to say, because sometimes they can buy it as a second and not use it, like, or there's nothing wrong with that. And then you change how you use it later. But when you do that, right, it changes the down payment requirements, right, Anthony?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe they have an IRA, or maybe they don't have an IRA or a 401k. Those are questions that you want to ask, but there's always a workaround. There's never, oh, they're married, they got to get a divorce decree. It's a dead deal. It's not a dead deal. You didn't ask the right question.
Well, it is a dead deal if you find out at the final hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we literally,
I just
it was
had
it sucks.
Dude, I
And I was like,
had a
shit.
client last month call me up. He's married. And he's like, yeah, we're going to have my girlfriend sign. I go, is your wife aware of this? Yeah, that's cool. Everything's great. I'm like, dude, get her on the phone. There's no way I'm not wasting my time. Get everyone on the phone, get them in the same rink. We're going to ask the question out loud. And sure as shit,
Awkward.
it was extremely awkward, but there was no way. I was thinking, what is this? Like, how is this even possible? And it was possible, and it was wild. Yeah, Dana. And
we've had some of those where we're like, wait, the closing room, there's like 3 guys and 1 woman.
3 guys.
I don't know. It created so much confusion. Like, who's who here? Like, I don't even know. It happens. And as long as things like are done by the books, it's fine, but we need to ask those questions, right? So that is the purpose of today's episode, is to bring awareness to this, remind you guys to have this question in your intake. And then if you're not sure, ask the question, get the response, call us up, and we'll happy to guide you, because we don't want you working for nothing.
It sucks. I've had it happen in my career twice, and I said that's the last time. It sucks.
This is the first time it's happened like this.
Oh, there's always going to be crazy stories, but I mean,
But yeah, and so of course, myself, how I am, I go back, I go through. No, but she never responded. I'm like, because we always ask, right? So going through, pushing forward, and making sure like that this doesn't happen again is important. We're also going to be doing some educational videos. I've been saying this for 2 years. I need to do my videos to like explain why to borrowers and sellers, but that'll come one day. It'll come soon. But yeah, that's really it. So the same thing on the intake, when you're sitting down doing a buyer consultation, ask those questions. Ask them because you know why it's so important. Explain to them why it's an important question if they give you some feedback on that or pushback. And then if there is those tricky gray lines, like they're going through a divorce, they are separated, but still married, obviously, those are the things that you're going to have to escalate and speak to the lender before you go under contract. Like, how are we going to make this work? Right? Yeah. Don't ask. We can't make this work at the final hour. We need time. We need strategy. So
yeah, it's wise to ask those questions because you save time, you save face, and you save just relationships, everything. It's better to have an answer up front, and it might not be an answer an agent wants to hear. Oh, he doesn't want to entertain these loans. He's too busy for this, blah, blah, blah. It's not that. There's so many intricacies that will make that loan blow up. And why are we going to mess up the brand name? You know what I mean? Like that's all we have is our reputation and our brand. And to make this elephant get forced through a mouse hole it's nonsense. So yep. Great stuff, Melinda.
Awesome. So I hope you guys found this topic helpful, useful. We are always open for additional topics that you guys want to see us discussing. But yeah, that's a wrap for today, episode 51. We always ask that if you like our show, make sure to share it with friends. And that's a wrap. Have an amazing rest of your week, guys.
Take care, guys. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.